Cold rain lashed fiercely against the tall, arched windows of Wycliffe House, blurring the grey London afternoon into a watery, suffocating smear. The cavernous room smelled intensely of melting wax and the damp wool of heavy overcoats. A sharp, metallic tang of coal dust clung tightly to the sleeve of a nervous mine manager. Nathaniel Ashbourne, the Duke of Ravenshire, stood rigidly near the far end of the long mahogany table. Half-empty porcelain cups of cold tea sat abandoned beside the ceaseless, frantic scratching of quills. A dozen panicked solicitors, desperate creditors, and anxious relatives waited in agonizing silence. They were waiting for the arrival of the unknown principal creditor. At the head of the long table, Lord Percival Wycliffe occupied the massive, heavily carved chairman's chair. He smoothed his silver-embroidered waistcoat. He addressed the tense room as though every single person present were infinitely beneath him. He insisted, with his practiced, polished arrogance, that the Wycliffe financial difficulties were merely temporary. Nathaniel watched his father-in-law without speaking a single word. His wife, Lady Arabella, had been dead for exactly 8 months. Nathaniel felt utterly trapped in the cavernous room. He was caught painfully between a fading loyalty to her quiet memory and the mounting, undeniable proof that her father had lied repeatedly about the vast Wycliffe wealth. The grand estate was quietly bleeding to death, and Nathaniel's own prestigious title was firmly tethered to the corpse. The heavy oak double doors suddenly groaned open. The room's nervous, quiet murmurs snapped into immediate, breathless silence. Mr. Gideon Bell stepped across the threshold, a dry, exact-looking solicitor wearing a severe black coat. He carried a thick leather portfolio. He cleared his throat. Adjusting his spectacles, he announced to the silent assembly that the overwhelming majority of the secured Wycliffe obligations had recently been assigned to a single, anonymous creditor. And then she stepped out from the shadows of the corridor. Nathaniel stopped breathing. The polished floor seemed to simply drop away beneath his boots. Eleanor Vale appeared just behind the solicitor. The warm, expressive, fiercely trusting childhood girl he had ruthlessly abandoned 3 years ago was entirely gone. In her place stood a woman composed, formidable, and richly but severely dressed in dark, unadorned silk. She commanded the heavy space without speaking a single word. Everyone in the room instinctively recognized the shift in power. The rigid, cautious solicitors flanking her were waiting solely for her instruction. She walked slowly along the edge of the table. The rustle of her silk skirt sounded like a drawn blade in the quiet room. Her calm eyes swept over the nervous investors and finally landed on him. Nathaniel braced his shoulders, waiting for the furious, burning hatred he wholly, desperately deserved. She merely inclined her head. "Your Grace," she said softly. The formal title sounded like ash in her mouth. There was no fury in her steady tone, no tremor of a breaking heart. Her cold, professional indifference pierced him far deeper than any screaming accusation ever could. She looked at him as though he were merely a line on a ledger, an obstacle entirely devoid of emotional weight. Lord Percival scoffed, his face flushing a dangerous, dark red. He slammed his palm against the mahogany wood, loudly demanding to know why a minor provincial gentleman's daughter was interrupting a confidential financial assembly. Mr. Bell placed his heavy leather portfolio on the table. He unfastened the brass buckles with deliberate slowness. He explained, with exact and devastating clarity, that the creditor who now controlled the meeting and the very survival of the Wycliffe Empire was Miss Eleanor Vale. Percival sneered, his fingers gripping the carved arms of his chair like talons. He absolutely refused to move. He declared the notion absurd, his voice rising in panic and fury. Eleanor said absolutely nothing. She stood perfectly still, letting the older man's bluster echo and die against the damp stone walls. Mr. Bell silently withdrew a thick stack of parchment assignments. They bore heavy, undeniable bank seals. He placed them one by one onto the polished wood, He gently informed Lord Percival that without Miss Vale's temporary stay of foreclosure, the London sheriff would begin immediate seizure proceedings against the Wycliffe accounts, the coal mines, the ancestral properties. Percival stared down at the dark wax seals. The colour completely vanished from his face, leaving his skin pale and lined. The polished arrogance shattered into pathetic pieces. His hands trembled violently as he realized he was entirely cornered. Slowly, painfully, the older man rose to his feet. He stepped back. He reached out and pulled the massive chairman's chair away from the table, silently offering it to the very woman he had once deemed utterly unsuitable to sit in his presence. The grand room fell deathly silent. Eleanor stepped forward and took the seat. She did not smile. She did not cast a triumphant, gloating glance at Nathaniel. She simply settled into the velvet cushion. She opened the first heavy account book and immediately began discussing miners' wages, neglected tenant leases, and unpaid widow compensation. Nathaniel watched her trace a gloved finger down a complex column of numbers. The crushing, brilliant reality finally settled over his weary shoulders. She had not come to London merely to exact petty revenge, or to humiliate the family that had discarded her. She had come to decide what human lives survived the ruin. She turned the heavy parchment page. The sharp scratching of her pen was the only sound in the cavernous room. She looked up, her calm, steady gaze locking directly onto his. "The next secured property," Eleanor said, her voice ringing with absolute, terrifying clarity, "is Ravenshire." Nathaniel felt the air leave his lungs. The ancient, ancestral estate he had cowardly traded his soul to save was now entirely in her hands. The heavy wheels of the ducal carriage crunched violently against the frozen gravel of the Ravenshire driveway. Nathaniel Ashbourne stepped out into the biting winter wind. The grand, ancient house loomed before him, a magnificent stone fortress. But as he walked through the massive front doors, the air inside was desperately cold. Despite the vast Wycliffe marriage settlement, money remained incredibly tight. Half of the majestic rooms were completely closed off. The grand fireplaces sat empty, filled only with cold, grey ash. Unable to bear the echoing silence of the main hall, Nathaniel walked back out into the freezing estate grounds. He followed a narrow, overgrown path toward the eastern boundary. He stopped before a small, wrought-iron gate. It was wrapped in heavy, rusted chains. Lord Percival had ordered it permanently sealed 3 years ago. It was the physical border between Ravenshire and Vale Grange. Nathaniel reached out, his gloved hand brushing the frozen metal. The touch instantly pulled him back into a vibrant, agonizing past. Before the crushing weight of the title had shaped him, this gate had always stood wide open. He remembered the bright, unburdened laughter of a younger Eleanor, sharing stolen books in the high summer grass, kneeling in the damp earth to rescue a frightened, injured fox, racing horses across the open fields, and carving their tangled initials deep into the bark of the ancient oak tree. As they grew older, the innocent childhood bond blossomed into a quiet, profound devotion. It was a warm, undeniable affection, silently understood by both families. Even without a formal engagement, he had belonged entirely to her. And then, his father died. Nathaniel inherited the grand dukedom, but when he opened the heavy estate ledgers, he discovered absolute, terrifying ruin. Crushing debts from generations of reckless gambling, leaking roofs collapsing on the tenant farmers, unpaid wages driving the loyal household staff to starvation. He was terrified of losing the ancestral land and displacing 500 innocent families. Then, Lord Percival Wycliffe arrived. The wealthy baron offered Arabella's enormous dowry and unlimited access to the Wycliffe credit lines. But the price was Nathaniel's hand in marriage. Nathaniel convinced himself that marrying for money was a noble, necessary sacrifice. The bitter memory shifted to a glittering winter ball. Eleanor had stood in the center of the crowded ballroom, her eyes shining with absolute trust. She fully expected him to step forward and announce their engagement. Instead, Nathaniel stood before the aristocratic crowd and formally announced his impending marriage to Lady Arabella. Minutes later, Eleanor cornered him in a private, dimly lit portrait gallery. Freezing rain lashed violently against the glass windows. Nathaniel knew that if he showed even a single trace of hesitation, if he let her see how desperately he still loved her, he would break his terrible bargain. So, he used cruelty to force her away. He spoke with cold, clinical precision. He told her that a duke could not marry childhood memories, that the modest Vale family could never sustain Ravenshire, and that love could not feed 500 starving tenants. Eleanor stared at him, her warm, expressive face turning completely hollow. "Did our entire life together," she whispered, her voice trembling in the cold room, "mean less to you than a settlement contract?" Nathaniel looked directly into her breaking eyes, and he lied. "It did," he answered. Eleanor stepped back. She did not weep. She looked at the grand, echoing walls of the gallery. "You have chosen a house," she said softly, leaving him with a final devastating truth. Over the only person who ever made it a home. Nathaniel stood alone by the rusted gate, the freezing wind pulling him back to the present. He stared at the heavy iron chains. The crushing reality was finally undeniable. The loveless marriage had saved the estate only temporarily, but it had saved absolutely no one emotionally. Not Eleanor, not Arabella, and certainly not himself. Footsteps crunched on the gravel path behind him. Mr. Samuel Reed, the loyal estate steward, walked briskly through the cold, his breath pluming in the freezing air. He carried a formal, sealed document. "Your Grace," Reed said softly, knowing exactly how much the Duke had regretted his choice for the past 3 years. "A messenger just arrived from London. Miss Vale will be here tomorrow morning to personally inspect the property securing her debt." Nathaniel closed his eyes, taking a slow, ragged breath. He nodded. "Prepare the ledgers, Samuel," Nathaniel said. "Give her full access to the estate accounts." Reed hesitated, his grip tightening on the heavy parchment. "She did not just ask for the Ravenshire accounts." "Your Grace," the steward warned, his voice dropping to a tense whisper. "Miss Vale has legally demanded immediate, unrestricted access to Lady Arabella's sealed marriage papers." The crisp, morning frost crunched loudly beneath the heavy wooden wheels of the carriage. Eleanor Vale sat in the dim cabin, staring straight ahead through the cold glass window. She had explicitly ordered her driver to use the long, public outer road to reach Ravenshire. She absolutely refused to use the small, rusted childhood gate that connected their 2 estates. It remained firmly sealed, just as it had been for 3 agonizing years. When the carriage halted before the grand stone steps, Nathaniel was already waiting. Seeing him standing there in the pale winter light sent a sharp, physical ache straight through her chest. But she ruthlessly clamped down on the emotion. She forced herself to breathe. She anchored her mind entirely in the cold, unyielding reality of figures, leases, and financial obligations. As they walked together across the vast estate grounds, Eleanor's sharp eyes missed absolutely nothing. She noted the rotting thatch on the small tenant cottages. She saw the freezing drafts leaking through poorly patched roofs. It made absolutely no sense. Massive sums of money from the Wycliffe dowry were supposed to have repaired these exact homes. Nathaniel walked closely beside her, his broad shoulders heavy with unspoken guilt. He stopped near a frozen pond, turning to face her. He desperately tried to offer a quiet, agonized apology. Eleanor did not let him finish. She held up a single, gloved hand. "I came to examine your accounts, Your Grace," she said, her voice perfectly smooth and entirely hollow. "Not your conscience." She walked right past him, stepping into the dusty, echoing estate office. Her absolute, intimidating composure was not a miraculous gift. It had been forged in pure desperation. After her father died, she had inherited nothing but Vale Grange, a neglected, broken watermill, 2 empty grain warehouses, and a mountain of crushing debt. Potential buyers had circled like vultures, fully expecting her to panic and sell the land for pennies. But Eleanor had refused to break. She sat alone in the dark, studying every single lease and account book. She quickly discovered that her ruined mill controlled the vital water access for the entire valley, and her narrow strip of muddy land completely controlled access to a highly profitable canal wharf. She approached the local craftsmen. She offered them a fair, legally binding share of future profits, rather than immediate coin. To repair the massive wooden water wheel, she converted her empty buildings into secure grain storage for the local farmers, allowing them to safely hoard their harvest and completely avoid selling during the lowest price weeks of the season. The profits steadily grew. Soon, she formed a discreet partnership with Beatrice Mercer, a brilliant, widowed Liverpool merchant. Beatrice did not hand Eleanor effortless wealth. She simply introduced her to the complex, ruthless world of distressed mortgage paper. Eleanor learned a vital lesson. She learned to buy debt only when she fully understood the dirt beneath it. During her research, she noticed the wealthy Wycliffe family aggressively borrowing under several different names. They were securing massive new loans against the exact same, overlapping assets. She quietly bought up those obligations through her solicitor. She did not do it out of bitter, petty revenge against Nathaniel. She bought them because the Wycliffe transport rights and the coal mines perfectly fit her own growing, strategic network. Now, sitting at the massive oak desk in Ravenshire, Eleanor opened the heavy estate ledgers. She ran her finger down a long column of faded ink. She stopped. A massive, exorbitant payment, vaguely labelled as tenant repairs, had been secretly transferred completely out of Ravenshire, routed directly into a private Wycliffe family account. Nathaniel stared down at the ledger, his face draining of colour. He appeared genuinely, profoundly shocked by the blatant theft. But Eleanor did not blindly trust the reaction. She had learned the hard way that a duke's honour was rarely absolute. Before she could demand an explanation, Mr. Reed, the estate steward, hurried into the room. He carried a heavy, locked dispatch box. It had just been discovered hidden beneath the floorboards in the old Duchess's room. It belonged entirely to Lady Arabella. The lock had already been forced open. Inside, resting on the velvet lining, was a single, thick parchment letter. Eleanor carefully lifted the heavy paper. Written across the front, in Arabella's elegant, flowing script, was a chilling instruction to Miss Eleanor Vale. The inscription read, "If my father's house finally falls." The quiet estate office grew completely still. Eleanor looked at the dark red wax sealing the envelope. She looked up at Nathaniel, meeting his tense, breathless gaze, and with a sharp, decisive snap, she broke the seal. The musty, bitter scent of old parchment, mixed with the sharp smell of crumbling sealing wax, drifted through the quiet, freezing estate office. Eleanor held Arabella's heavy letter in her hands. She looked up at Nathaniel. She waited for his absolute consent, because the truth always mattered far more than private secrets. Nathaniel gave a slow, ragged nod. Eleanor's voice rose, clear and ringing against the cold stone walls. In the letter, Arabella confessed a heartbreaking truth. She had always known that Nathaniel loved only Eleanor, but she had been given absolutely no choice. Arabella wrote that her own father had used her as collateral, trading her like a piece of property to secure a powerful alliance with a duke. Their grand marriage had been nothing but a civil, hollow shell, completely empty of any real emotion. Eleanor read further, and the horrifying truth about the vast Wycliffe wealth was finally dragged into the light. Arabella's massive dowry was not liquid cash or gold. It was built entirely on massive new loans. secured against coal mines and tenant lands that had already been pledged to other creditors long ago. But the most ruthless betrayal was yet to come. After a devastating mine collapse, Arabella had discovered that the compensation fund for the grieving families was completely empty. Lord Percival had stolen the entire fund. He had secretly diverted the money into a private account, simply to make his financial portfolio appear wealthy enough to secure the Ravenshire marriage settlement. Arabella's final, desperate plea made Eleanor's chest tighten. The late wife did not ask Eleanor to save the prestigious Wycliffe name. She begged Eleanor to save the innocent people who were trapped and crushed beneath it. The letter clearly identified a hidden strongbox, locked away inside the private Wycliffe family chapel. Inside it, Arabella had hidden duplicate ledgers and the original, unaltered mine casualty reports. Just an hour later, a heavy carriage tore through the muddy, frozen roads toward the chapel. The cramped, suffocating space inside the cabin forced Eleanor and Nathaniel to sit directly opposite one another. The carriage swayed violently over the frozen ruts in the road. Every sudden jolt brought their knees dangerously close to touching. The familiar sharp scent of cedar and cold rain clinging to his heavy coat accidentally awakened old, intimate childhood habits. She remembered a time when she would have naturally reached out to steady him, but Eleanor ruthlessly crushed the impulse down. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest, maintaining an absolute, freezing professional distance. Inside the damp, silent chapel, the air smelled heavily of old dust and rotting wood. They found the iron strongbox hidden behind a loose stone in the wall, exactly where Arabella had promised. But when Nathaniel forced the heavy iron lid open, their desperate hope completely vanished. The box was completely empty. All of the vital ledgers had already been stolen. The only things left behind were a single, violently torn ledger page and a heavily rusted brass key. Late that afternoon, they brought the rusted key to the miserable, freezing cottages of the coal miners. The air inside was thick with the suffocating stench of burning peat and unwashed wool. Mrs. Clara Dobbs, the grieving widow of a miner crushed in the collapse, burst into tears the exact moment she saw it. She recognized the brass key immediately. It belonged to the old compensation office. Clara choked back a violent sob as she revealed a ruthless, sickening truth. The desperate widows had been violently forced to sign official receipts, acknowledging payment, but they had never received a single copper coin. Nathaniel stood paralyzed in the center of the rotting cottage. His heart was crushed by an overwhelming, suffocating guilt. He realized that Arabella had lived her entire marriage carrying a terrible, shameful fear, a fear he had never once bothered to notice. His crushing guilt no longer belonged only to Eleanor. It now stretched to the quiet woman he had married. Eleanor looked at him, her eyes steady, but filled with a profound, quiet ache. "Arabella was never my rival," Eleanor said softly, her voice piercing the heavy silence. "Both of us were simply treated as assets in a bargain between men." At that exact moment, the frantic pounding of hooves echoed outside the thin wooden door. A breathless messenger burst in, carrying a heavy parchment sealed with Lord Percival's dark wax. Mr. Bell, the cautious solicitor, quickly broke the seal and scanned the harsh ink. His face turned ashen. Lord Percival had officially issued a formal legal notice. He was fiercely accusing Eleanor of a criminal conspiracy to obtain the Wycliffe debts. He was threatening an immediate court injunction to freeze her entire control of the estate. Mr. Bell looked up, his eyes filled with absolute, terrifying warning. "Miss Vale," the solicitor said, his voice dropping to a tense whisper, "if Lord Percival can convince the judge that you bought these debts out of personal revenge, the court will strip you of all authority, long before we ever find those missing ledgers." The crisp, morning air of London carried the harsh scent of damp coal smoke and horse manure. Across the city, the newly printed morning newspapers hit the cobblestone streets, Lord Percival Wycliffe had moved swiftly. He had fed his polished, distorted version of events directly to the broadsheets. The articles painted Eleanor in a deeply malicious light. They portrayed her as a bitter, vengeful provincial woman, a woman who was using ruthless merchant money to exact a petty, personal revenge against a noble family because of a failed romantic attachment from her youth. High society gasped over their breakfast tables. Polite drawing rooms openly mocked the absurd notion that a mere woman could ever truly understand complex land obligations, banking trusts, and secured mortgages. Nathaniel walked into the private parlour of Eleanor's London residence. His face was hard with controlled fury. He immediately offered to use his powerful ducal title, his personal wealth, and his influential parliamentary allies to violently silence the newspapers and crush the slander. Eleanor did not even look up from her paperwork. She stood by the tall window, her posture rigid and unyielding. "You silenced me once for my own supposed protection," Eleanor said, her voice cutting through the quiet room like a sharp blade. "You will not do it again." Nathaniel flinched as though he had been physically struck. He opened his mouth to argue, but the cold, absolute finality in her eyes stopped the words in his throat. He slowly closed his mouth and stepped back. Mr. Gideon Bell stepped forward to break the tense, suffocating silence. The dry, exact solicitor announced that they would not fight the scandal with petty public insults or emotional arguments. Instead, they would respond strictly through the unbending power of the law. Bell immediately began preparing a formal, legally bulletproof response, utilizing precise deeds, unalterable dates, and undeniable creditor rights. To counter Lord Percival's poison, Eleanor made a public announcement that stunned the local tenants and workers. She formally declared that she would not immediately foreclose on a single worker's cottage or tenant farm. Instead, she offered them revised, fair leases, guaranteed safe mine inspections, and humane repayment terms. She chose to protect the people rather than punish them. Lord Percival realized his public smear campaign was failing to break her financial grip. In a desperate move, he secretly arranged a public auction for a small, strategically vital canal parcel. That specific strip of land was the absolute linchpin of Eleanor's entire transport and shipping network. Percival expected a friendly, hidden proxy bidder to purchase it cheaply and immediately snap her commercial leverage in half. On the day of the auction, the crowded sale room hummed with nervous tension. Eleanor sat in the front row, her expression an impenetrable mask of calm. She raised her hand to place her bid. Suddenly, a deep, resonant voice called out from across the room. Nathaniel unexpectedly began bidding against her. Eleanor's head whipped around. Her heart plummeted into a cold, dark abyss. The price climbed higher and higher, rapidly soaring far beyond her planned, maximum financial limit. Panic and sharp betrayal twisted tightly inside her chest. She was entirely certain that Nathaniel had turned on her again. She believed he had once more chosen the corrupt Wycliffe family wealth and his own aristocratic convenience over her. With one final, heavy raise of his hand, Nathaniel won the parcel. The auctioneer's hammer crashed down. Outside the bustling auction house, in the cold, grey drizzle, Eleanor confronted him. Her voice shook with a quiet, devastating fury. "You have always known the price of everything," Eleanor whispered, her eyes burning with unshed tears. "Except the cost of being trusted." Nathaniel did not offer a single word in his own defense. He did not flinch from her biting words. He simply reached into his overcoat, pulled out the heavy packet of official deeds, and wordlessly handed them directly to his solicitor before walking away into the rain. Later that evening, Mr. Bell arrived at Eleanor's study with a stunned, bewildered expression on his face. He placed the deed packet on her desk. The solicitor revealed a breathtaking truth. Nathaniel had not bought the land to crush her or to help Lord Percival. He had registered the valuable canal parcel immediately, not in his own name, nor under the Ravenshire title, but placed it entirely in a strict legal trust, dedicated solely to the tenant farmers and the Vale transport scheme. Eleanor stared at the documents in absolute shock. Nathaniel had appeared to brutally betray her trust one more time, but in reality, he had spent the very last of his available private funds to prevent Percival's proxy from seizing her lifeline. The heavy iron gates of the canal parcel swung smoothly open. Nathaniel transferred absolute legal control of the land directly to Eleanor without demanding a single word of gratitude, a promise of marriage, or a plea for forgiveness. Eleanor stared at the official papers, a profound confusion warring with the old ache in her chest. She looked up at him, her voice tight. She asked him why he would do such a thing. Nathaniel met her gaze, his expression stripped of all aristocratic pretense. "Because the land should serve the people living on it," he answered quietly. "I learned that from the woman I abandoned." A few days later, their shared mission pulled them into the dark, labyrinthine docklands of London. They stood inside one of the massive Wycliffe riverside warehouses, investigating the missing compensation accounts. The air was thick with the suffocating stench of rotting hemp, damp grain, and stale river water. Suddenly, a young man came running frantically through the shadows. It was Jonas Pike, a terrified 19-year-old junior clerk. The boy was trembling from head to toe. He whispered urgently that he had secretly copied Lord Percival's private, hidden ledgers. The stolen pages proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that Percival had systematically used multiple shell companies to mortgage the exact same mines over and over again. Before the terrified boy could hand over the complete, bound book, a sudden, bright flash of orange light cut through the dark corners of the warehouse. Flames erupted along the wooden packing crates. Someone had set the building ablaze to bury the evidence forever. Panic gripped the narrow aisles as black smoke billowed toward the high rafters. Eleanor did not freeze. Shedding her initial shock, she stepped into immediate command, organizing the warehouse laborers, shouting for water lines, and securing the emergency exits rather than waiting passively for rescue. Inside the burning office, Nathaniel spotted Jonas trapped beneath a collapsed stack of heavy oak shelving. Nearby, the iron chest containing the vital account ledgers sat engulfed in hungry flames. Nathaniel did not hesitate. He lunged through the wall of choking smoke, completely bypassing the heavy iron chest. He threw his weight against the fallen shelving, heaved it off the trapped boy, and swept the terrified clerk up into his arms. He dragged Jonas out into the fresh air, just as the ceiling beams crashed down. It was a direct, breathtaking reversal of his past. 3 years ago, he had sacrificed a human life for an estate and a title. Tonight, he deliberately chose a human life over the very evidence and property he needed to save himself. When the smoke finally cleared, Nathaniel stood coughing heavily against the cool dockside drizzle. His left hand was badly blistered and burned from the heat, and his lungs burned with thick soot. Eleanor rushed to his side. She guided him into a nearby, quiet estate office. Finding a basin of clean water and a clean linen cloth, she set to work tending to his injuries. The small room grew intensely intimate, charged with a heavy, unspoken tension. She gently washed the black soot from his brow and carefully dabbed a cooling salve across his burned knuckles. She moved with absolute precision, but her fingers brushed softly against his skin. Nathaniel sat completely still, watching her every movement with a raw, agonizing vulnerability. He did not reach out to touch her. He did not ask for comfort or force his presence upon her. He waited for permission that never came. The physical distance between them had narrowed, but the deep emotional chasm remained untouched. Outside in the corridor, a battered, shivering Jonas Pike was revived with a cup of hot tea. The young clerk looked up at Eleanor with wide, tearful eyes. He reached inside his heavy wool coat and pulled out a single, soot-stained page he had managed to salvage before the fire consumed the rest. "I saved this one," Jonas gasped, handing the paper over to Eleanor. "It was tucked deep inside the lining of my jacket." Eleanor took the fragile page. She carried it to the desk lamp, spreading it flat under the harsh yellow light. Written across the bottom of the financial transfer document was a bold, unmistakable signature. It bore Nathaniel's name, authorizing the illegal movement of the widow fund money directly into a private Wycliffe account. Eleanor turned slowly, her eyes locking onto Nathaniel as he stepped into the light. Nathaniel stared down at the signature. The blood drained entirely from his face. He recognized the sweeping curves instantly. It was his handwriting. He remembered signing a massive, thick bundle of routine marriage settlement papers on his wedding day, blindly trusting his new family, without ever reading the terrifying fine print. Eleanor looked at him, her voice dropping to a harsh, devastating whisper. "Whether you understood it or not, Your Grace," Eleanor said, the paper trembling in her hand. "Your name helped him steal from the dead." Nathaniel sat alone in the dim, freezing quiet of his private study. He spent hours reviewing every single document, letter, and contract bearing his signature. The cold reality slowly settled over him. He realized with sickening clarity that his absolute negligence, his blind desire to secure the marriage settlement, and his desperate rush to save his title had given Lord Percival unearned legitimacy. His reckless trust had actively prevented earlier scrutiny into the Wycliffe finances. Worse still, he discovered a terrifying truth. If he made a public admission of his reckless oversight, it would immediately expose Ravenshire to devastating legal claims. It could even strip him of his influential position on the parliamentary committee. The very next morning, Lord Percival requested a private, urgent meeting. The older man arrived with his usual polished, arrogant smile. Percival laid out a clean, calculated bargain. He proposed that Nathaniel publicly denounce Eleanor as a bitter, vindictive woman. In exchange, Percival promised to produce official, falsified records claiming that the transfer of the widow fund had been entirely lawful. Furthermore, the massive debt charge against Ravenshire would be instantly cancelled, and Nathaniel's pristine political reputation would remain completely untouched. Percival leaned forward, spinning his web with practiced ease. He argued smoothly that a duke had a sacred duty to protect hundreds of innocent tenants. He hypocritically repeated Nathaniel's own old justification from the day of the original betrayal. Nathaniel stared at the older man. He was genuinely tempted. Not because he cared about personal wealth or luxury, but because he knew the horrifying truth. If Ravenshire was violently seized by creditors, hundreds of innocent tenant families would be thrown out onto the freezing winter streets. Later that afternoon, as Nathaniel stepped out of Percival's private club, Eleanor caught sight of him from across the street, standing in the cold rain, watching him emerge from the antagonist's stronghold. A cold wave of absolute devastation washed over her. She assumed he had been inside, negotiating a final, corrupt deal against her. The next morning, the grand parliamentary inquiry room was packed to suffocation. Aristocratic lords, curious journalists, and tense creditors crowded every inch of the gallery. Lord Percival took the floor, brazenly shifting the entire blame onto Eleanor and the late, defenseless Arabella. When Nathaniel was formally invited to the center of the room, the assembly fell completely silent. He was expected to step forward and confirm that he had knowingly approved the transfer of funds as part of his marital duties. Nathaniel stood before the assembly. He looked up, his dark eyes sweeping over the crowded gallery until they finally locked onto Eleanor. He did not lie. He did not protect his title or hide behind the convenient excuses of his social class. In a clear, steady voice that echoed off the cold stone walls, Nathaniel confessed that he had signed the documents without ever examining the terrifying fine print. He openly admitted that he had gladly benefited from a corrupt marriage arrangement, and that he had allowed fear, cowardice, and an obsession with his family name to completely replace his moral judgment. Without warning, he calmly unpinned his parliamentary badge of office. He formally resigned his committee position on the spot, and explicitly waived any aristocratic privilege or legal immunity that might delay a full, unhindered investigation into the accounts. "I chose wealth over truth once," Nathaniel declared to the stunned, breathless room. "Every disaster in this hall grew from that single, cowardly choice. I will not make it again." The quiet assembly erupted into chaotic, deafening shouts. Before the gavel could crash down to restore order, the Crown's chief solicitor moved swiftly. Citing the explosive admissions and the overwhelming mountain of financial discrepancies, The court issued an immediate order freezing all disputed Wycliffe and Ravenshire assets pending a full criminal inquiry. The ancient, magnificent ancestral estate of Ravenshire was no longer safe. To satisfy the mounting tide of legitimate claims and unpaid debts, the grand estate faced the very real, terrifying possibility of being sold off piece by piece at public auction. Nathaniel had finally chosen the truth, but the catastrophic price of his redemption was the complete loss of everything he had once committed murder to protect. Eleanor sat late into the night beneath the flickering yellow light of her study desk. She smoothed Arabella's heavy, folded letter out flat against the wood. Her eyes scanned the familiar ink for the 100th time. Suddenly, a persistent detail caught her attention. It was a repeated, mocking reference to a specific item the hymn book mother hated. Without a moment's hesitation, Eleanor packed her small leather case and travelled back to the cold, echoing chambers of the private Wycliffe family chapel. Moving past the altar, she searched the dark timber shelves of the vestry until her fingers brushed against an old, leather-bound book hidden behind a stack of dusty prayer manuals. She opened the brittle cover. Scrawled across the inside margins in a frantic, hurried hand was a coded list of secret bank account numbers. She rushed back to London before dawn, bringing the discovery straight to Madame Odette and Mr. Gideon Bell. Working together in tense, hurried silence, the legal minds cross-referenced the hidden numbers against financial registries. The numbers matched perfectly to a private, unauthorized bank account that had secretly received the stolen widow fund money. Moments later, Mrs. Clara Dobbs arrived at the office. Inspecting the ledger extracts, Clara pointed out specific dates that aligned identically with the tragic day of the mine collapse and the issuance of the false payment receipts. Shortly after, a terrified Jonas Pike arrived with more crucial information. The young clerk testified under oath that Lord Percival had explicitly ordered him to copy clean, falsified ledgers only after the original, authentic books had been secretly moved from the main offices. According to Jonas, those missing original ledgers were currently stored inside a damp, vulnerable riverside warehouse, scheduled for immediate demolition by the local council. Realizing that time was running out, Eleanor, Nathaniel, Mr. Bell, and a small group of trusted constables moved swiftly. They arrived at the sprawling dockside warehouse, just as Lord Percival's hired enforcers had begun loading wooden crates onto a waiting cart. A tense, violent confrontation erupted inside the cavernous, drafty building. Nathaniel did not act as an invincible hero. Instead, the local constables and sturdy warehouse workers handled the physical restraint of the guards, while Nathaniel pushed past them to reach the heavy oak storage chests. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the space. The rotten floorboards beneath their feet gave way under the strain. Eleanor, who had been checking a stack of documents near the edge, lost her footing. She plunged backward toward the deep, dark canal loading pit. At the exact same second, a massive wooden crate filled with the irreplaceable original ledgers slipped from its tether, tilting precariously over the drop. Nathaniel lunged forward across the fracturing wood. He reached out an arm with desperate, blinding speed. He could grab the heavy rope holding the crate of evidence, securing the legal proof needed to completely destroy Lord Percival once and for all, or he could lunge further and catch Eleanor's outstretched hand. He did not hesitate for even a fraction of a second. Nathaniel let go of the rope entirely. The heavy crate of ledgers plummeted downward, smashing into the water below and dissolving into a useless mass of ruined paper. With his other arm, Nathaniel gripped Eleanor's wrist with all his might, hauling her upward off the crumbling edge and pulling her safely against his chest. They collapsed together onto the stable floorboards, breathing heavily as the dust settled around them. Shaken and trembling from the close brush with death, Eleanor pulled back. She looked down at the dark pit where the final evidence had just vanished, then up at him with a mixture of disbelief and anguish. "Why did you let the evidence fall?" she asked, her voice cracking slightly. Nathaniel looked down into her eyes, his expression completely stripped of fear or regret. "Because no truth worth saving," Nathaniel whispered softly, "requires me to lose you again." They stood up slowly, believing the physical proof was gone forever. But just as despair threatened to take hold, young Jonas Pike hurried over, clutching a small, wax-sealed packet to his chest. The young clerk caught his breath and explained a final, vital secret. Before Lord Percival could intercept the files, Arabella had anticipated the danger. She had secretly commanded Jonas to make a second complete copy of every single document and place it safely with a trusted country notary under an unassociated estate name. The notary's sealed packet was scheduled to be officially unsealed and read aloud the very next morning at the final Wycliffe creditors' hearing. The grand meeting room of Wycliffe House was packed to suffocation. The heavy air smelled of damp wool, stale wax, and rising panic. Eleanor Vale stepped through the double doors and walked straight to the head of the long table. Without a moment of hesitation, she took her seat in the massive carved chairman's chair. The second chair beside her remained completely empty. Lord Percival Wycliffe arrived moments later, his face flushed with a desperate, arrogant confidence. He firmly believed that the fallen ledgers and the ruined crate in the canal had destroyed any chance they had of proving his fraud. He sneered at the assembly, certain he had won. Mr. Gideon Bell calmly stood up and signaled the country notary. The notary stepped forward and broke the heavy red wax seals on Arabella's final packet. The evidence poured out into the open room in an unbroken, devastating chain. First came the original, unaltered mine casualty reports, proving the true scale of the disasters Lord Percival had hidden for years. Next were the duplicate mortgage deeds, exposing how he had secretly pledged the exact same properties to multiple unsuspecting lenders. Then came the widow receipts bearing forged witness signatures, followed by the private account transfer slips. Jonas Pike stepped forward to present his meticulously copied ledgers, while Clara Dobbs delivered her heartbreaking, unshakable testimony about the stolen compensation funds. Finally, the notary read aloud Arabella's signed statement and Nathaniel's public admission that he had signed the fraudulent documents without examining them. Percival's composure completely shattered. He slammed his fists onto the mahogany table, screaming wildly that Eleanor had engineered the entire conspiracy out of bitter, vindictive vengeance because Nathaniel had rejected her years ago. Eleanor did not raise her voice. She looked at him with icy, immovable composure. Motive does not alter dates, seals, signatures, or missing money, Lord Percival, she said quietly. Sensing his absolute ruin, Percival played his final, desperate card. He pulled out the original Wycliffe loan charge held against Ravenshire. He roared that if the Wycliffe empire collapsed, the debt would legally trigger the immediate seizure and sale of Ravenshire. He turned to Nathaniel, offering him one final, golden opportunity to challenge Eleanor's authority, denounce her evidence, and preserve his ancient ducal estate. Every eye in the room turned to Nathaniel. Nathaniel stood up slowly from his place near the wall. He did not look at Percival. He walked across the polished floor, unfastened the heavy brass keys of Ravenshire from his pocket, and placed them along with his ancestral title documents directly onto the wooden table in front of Eleanor. He looked at her with a quiet, absolute surrender. "I will not use my tenants as an excuse to repeat my cowardice," Nathaniel said, his voice ringing clearly through the silent room. "If the estate must be transferred to satisfy the debts, I will cooperate fully. My only condition is that the tenant protections remain absolute." Eleanor stared down at the keys resting beside her hand. In that defining second, she realized something profound. Nathaniel had voluntarily surrendered the very object he had once valued above her life, and he had done it without asking for anything in return. She looked up, her expression hardening with purposeful resolve, as she announced her final restructuring plan. She had officially purchased the controlling Ravenshire charge, but she would not seize a single tenant farm or throw a single family into the snow. Instead, the Wycliffe mines, canal lands, and warehouses would be reorganized under a strictly supervised legal settlement. Worker wages, essential safety repairs, and the long-overdue widow compensation would be paid out in full before any aristocratic creditors received a single penny of profit. Ravenshire would merely repay its legitimate debt slowly and honourably over time. Lord Percival shrieked in absolute madness, lunging forward before his own solicitor stepped back in utter disgust. Within moments, 2 armed constables moved in, gripping Percival by the shoulders and placing him under arrest for systematic fraud, forgery, and embezzlement. As the heavy oak doors closed behind the weeping, disgraced former baron, the cavernous room emptied until only silence remained. Nathaniel lingered near the table, standing alone in the quiet shadows. Eleanor turned her gaze slowly from the doorway. She looked at the empty wooden chair sitting right beside her. "You left me standing alone once," Eleanor said, her voice carrying the weight of 3 long years. Nathaniel took a slow, deliberate breath, meeting her steady gaze without flinching. "I know," he answered softly. Eleanor reached out, her fingers brushing gently against the arm of the vacant seat. "Then sit," she said, the first hint of an open invitation breaking through her armor. "We have work to do." The bright morning sunlight poured through the massive glass windows of the Vale and Ravenshire House of Commerce. The warm air hummed with the steady, rhythmic clicking of sewing shears and the low murmur of industrious workers. 6 months had passed since the devastating creditors' hearing. Eleanor walked through the bustling workshop, watching the proud, focused faces of the people laboring at the long wooden tables. She had actively hired war widows, the struggling daughters of injured craftsmen, and women who had been cruelly turned away from traditional apprenticeships elsewhere. More importantly, every single finished garment carried a carefully stitched tag, bearing the true name of the person who had crafted it. Under her roof, invisible labour no longer existed. Across London, Lord Percival Wycliffe faced the unyielding consequences of his systematic crimes. Following his arrest, he was formally convicted of fraud, forgery-related conspiracy, the malicious diversion of widow compensation funds, and the deliberate concealment of fatal mine deaths. All of his personal luxuries, his extensive carriage collection, his London residence, and his non-entailed investments were seized and sold at public auction. The proceeds were funneled first toward paying off the back wages of impoverished workers and fulfilling the long-overdue compensation owed to the miners' families. Percival lost total control of Wycliffe House and all commercial operations, his former high society allies abandoning him completely. Meanwhile, Lady Arabella's name was publicly and permanently separated from her father's crimes, her hidden evidence having exposed the corruption. The Wycliffe ancestral house was transformed not into a private trophy for Eleanor, but into an administrative centre and school dedicated to mine safety, tenant record-keeping, and fair apprenticeships. Clara Dobbs proudly oversaw the restored widow fund, ensuring no family would ever be cheated again. Young Jonas Pike became a properly paid, highly respected clerk under Mr. Bell's strict supervision. Unsafe mines remained permanently shuttered until independent engineering boards officially approved necessary safety structural repairs. For 6 entire months, Nathaniel Ashbourne worked steadily by Eleanor's side. He had sold his unnecessary London residence and his personal racing horses to help repay the legitimate Ravenshire obligations. He collaborated closely with tenant councils, proving through consistent, quiet action that he no longer treated his ducal title as an inherent proof of wisdom. He had never once pressured Eleanor for a romantic answer, honouring the heavy boundaries she set. On a crisp autumn afternoon, Nathaniel entered the main boardroom of the commercial house. He was not carrying a grand bouquet of flowers or a velvet ring box. Instead, he carried a plain, sturdy wooden chair. He walked over to Eleanor's desk and placed the wooden chair directly beside hers, not opposite it, and certainly not at the head of the table. Eleanor looked up, her expression a mixture of surprise and profound emotional tension. "I did not bring this chair to ask you to return to the place you once occupied in my life," Nathaniel said softly, his voice steady and completely devoid of arrogance. "That place depended on a childhood trust that I shattered through my own cowardice. I want to build a completely new place beside you, if you will freely choose it. But I offer it with absolute equality." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, polished iron object, rather than a family ring. He placed the rusted key to the childhood gate between them. The gate had been fully repaired, but it remained entirely unlocked from both sides. "May I walk through it, Eleanor?" he asked. Eleanor looked at the key, then up into his dark, unwavering eyes. "Forgiveness does not erase the past, Nathaniel," she answered quietly. "I know," he replied without hesitation. She accepted his partnership on unyielding conditions. Her property remained entirely under her own legal control. Her commercial work would continue uninterrupted, and their estate decisions would forever require shared authority. No child, tenant, or spouse would ever again be treated as disposable collateral for an aristocratic family name. Nathaniel accepted every single condition before she even finished speaking. 1 year later, during a vibrant annual tenant festival under the sweeping branches of the ancient oak tree, the true promise of their new life was realized. The gate between Vale Grange and Ravenshire stood wide open, inviting the breeze from both estates. Nathaniel offered Eleanor the first seat beneath the oak. She did not take it alone. Instead, she reached out, pulled the second chair right beside the first, and sat down with him. He had once broken her heart because he believed a great house required one person to stand above another. In the end, the only home worth saving began with 2 chairs placed side by side.